I had my eye on the clock. I think JD didn't use 6 of his minutes. I tend to be kind of long-winded, so I might use them myself, but we'll see. The other thing I was going to say is there's a lot of geekery in this, and I thought I was going to administer a test and see how much people retained, and then so I had a box of blue books I was going to leave in the back, and then I remembered that I'm a college professor, and the worst thing about being a college professor is, of course, grading papers, and I just scrapped the whole idea, so you're off the hook. All right, so I'm going to summarize certain points of political philosophy in this talk. But first I'm going to make a bold and large claim. I'm going to say all the great political philosophers, at least the ones that I've read, are anti-imperialist. I'm going to explain to you what their reasonings were. All right? I'm not going to try to prove that claim. It's pretty self-evident. Instead, I'm going to summarize their reasoning. Now, we begin, as we always should when we're talking about political philosophy, with Plato and Aristotle. They both make explicitly anti-imperialist statements. In particular, both of them, Plato specifically in the Laws, Aristotle in the Politics, examine the Spartan regime, and they find it seriously problematic for essentially the same reason. They say that the Spartans mistake a means, namely war, for an end, peace, or the things that war brings. So let me give you a little quote from Aristotle's Politics. He says that others assert that the mode of regime involving mastery and tyranny is the only happy one. Indeed, with some cities, this is the defining principle of the regime and the laws, that they exercise mastery over neighbors. Hence, while most of the usages existing among most cities are, so to speak, a mere jumble, nevertheless, if the laws anywhere look to one thing, it is domination that all of them aim at. In Sparta and Crete, for example, it is with a view to wars, the education and the greatest part of the laws originated. Further, all nations that are capable of aggrandizing themselves, power of this sort is honored. I'm going to skip a bit. He goes on and says, yet it may perhaps seem absurd to those wishing to investigate the matter, that this should be the function of one expert in politics, to be able to discern how to exercise imperial rule and mastery over others nearby, whether they wish it or not. How could this be characteristic of political or legislative expertise when it is not even lawful? It is not lawful to rule a city in this fashion justly, let alone unjustly, and it is possible to conquer others unjustly. Yet not even in the other sciences do we see this. It is not a function of the doctor or the pilot either to persuade or compel persons to submit to their rule, patients in one case, voyagers in the other. So that's a pretty explicit anti-imperialist statement from Aristotle there. Now, I'm going to go on. I want to discuss a bit another book. It's called The Education of Cyrus by Xenophon. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up, I think it's the greatest book that's really specifically about empire ever written. It purports to be a biography of Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire. And in fact, there was a real Cyrus the Great, as there was a real Persian Empire. But if you want to learn about him, don't read this book, because it has nothing to do with the actual historical Cyrus the Great. Herodotus talks about the real Cyrus the Great. Xenophon uses Cyrus the Great and reads into him what he wants to make a point. In fact, Xenophon was one of the few writers who knew Socrates personally, and the biographer of the philosophers, a man named Diogenes Laertius, says that Xenophon's Education of Cyrus is kind of his version of Plato's Republic. It's his way, his attempt to summarize Socrates' political teaching. So what is this book about? Well, Xenophon introduces it by saying that he looked out at the world and at political regimes, and he saw so many of them fail, pretty much all of them fail, that he thought politics must be impossible. No one knows how to rule other human beings. But then he remembered Cyrus. Cyrus ruled many human beings, and he thought it must be possible. So we'll study Cyrus and see how he made it work. So this is what he says at the beginning of the book in explaining his decision to examine Cyrus. He says that Cyrus, quote, acquired very many peoples, very many cities, and very many nations, all obedient to himself. He was willingly obeyed by some, even though they were distant from him by a journey of days, many days, by others distant by a journey of even months, and by others who had never yet seen him, and by still others who knew quite well they would never see him. Nevertheless, they were willing to submit, notice that word, to him. And he goes on, Cyrus, after finding nations in Asia in an independent condition, set out with a little army of Persians to become the leader of the Medes, who were willing that he do so, and over the Hyrcanians, who were also willing. And he subdued the Syrians, Assyrians, Arabians, Cappadocians, and he gives a long list here, and very many other nations whose names one cannot even say. He ruled also over the Greeks who were in Asia and going down to the sea, blah, blah, blah. He ruled these nations even though they did not speak the same language as either he himself or one another. Nevertheless, he was able to extend fear of himself to so much of the world that he intimidated all, and no one attempted anything against him. And he was able to implant in all so great a desire for gratifying him that they always thought it proper to be governed by his judgment. Now, I'm just going to ask, does that sound particularly attractive to anyone? Is that a regime you would want to be a part of? Maybe if you're personally our Cyrus, it sounds pretty good. For everybody else, though, you'd have to ask, like, what's so great about this? Okay, so I said this is the book, I think, about imperialism. And it's pretty damning from the get-go. He uses words like subdue, unfree. You know, he lays it out. Now, he's a clever writer, so throughout the rest of the book, he goes to great pains to make Cyrus seem very attractive. Cyrus is virtuous, politically adroit. He's smart, cool-headed. He wins a lot of battles, and he's clever. And plus, of course, everyone loves a winner, and Cyrus is a major winner, right? He starts with a little inheritance. He's like the guy who inherited, one dry cleaner, and then he owns every dry cleaner in 25 states by the time he's 40. And everybody loves a winner, okay? So it's superficial. There's an attractiveness. Persia is bigger, better, stronger than it is after Cyrus is done than before it starts out. Oh, I said bigger, better, stronger. It's definitely richer, bigger, stronger. But is it better? So Xenophon gives us a lot of reasons to think that it's not, right? It's not. What is lost throughout this? Well, first and foremost is liberty. The only person free in the new Persia is Cyrus himself. Everybody else is essentially a slave to Cyrus. He's the boss. He gives orders, you take them, and that's the end of that. There's no political freedom at all. There's no ability to collectively deliberate about public goods, public ends and means. There's a massive, we think of secret police and surveillance state and things like that as, you need technology to do it. It's new. It's a 20th century phenomenon. Well, Xenophon lays out Cyrus's secret police and surveillance state, 2,500 years ago. So you didn't apparently need to be able to listen to people's iPhones to do this. The Greeks knew, or the Persians at any rate, knew how to do it a long time ago. And the other thing is, you're holding down subject populations, which means you kind of always have to be at war. And that can be very burdensome on terms of taxes, and it also requires a draft. It requires compelled military service, right? Okay, what else is lost? Well, good government is lost. Government becomes arbitrary. Government becomes indistinguishable from the will of Cyrus. Now, lucky for the Persians, Cyrus is a good ruler, but what happens when you have a bad emperor? There's an old Russian proverb, the best regime is a good czar. The worst regime is a bad czar. I mean, that's kind of it. Those are your two choices if everything depends on one man, right? So, and also it's an unstable basis for rule. Now, the last chapter of the book shows the Persian Empire collapsing when everybody fights amongst themselves. It's so incongruous with what's come before that some commentators have said, Xenophon didn't write that. Some later person just slapped it on at the end. But I think Xenophon did write it, and he's meant to point out, like, this is actually not a great way to run any kind of a country. Okay, and the last point I'm going to make about the downside here is he shows that, we saw it from that quote, individual nations are subsumed in this regime. They get pushed underground. They have to be suppressed in order to hold the imperial project together. So all of this demonstrates the necessarily tyrannical character of imperial government. To make it work, whole swaths of human nature have to be suppressed. Okay, I'm going to go back a bit just to Aristotle. He says there are three fundamental political units: the tribe, the polis or city, and the empire. In a way, we can break that into two because there's something the tribe and the city have in common, and that they're both something like the nation. They're territorially distinct. They're probably linguistically distinct. There's some sense ethnically or culturally distinct. They're based on the principle of members versus non-members, or if you want to be really blunt and use the terminology the ancients would have used, friend and enemy, right? We don't need to take that too far. Plato makes the point in the Republic that, not everybody outside the border is necessarily an enemy, but they're a potential enemy. And even in the Republic, which is Plato at his most high-flown, theoretical, and universalist, the city has a border, right? There's a line. There are citizens on one side of the line, non-citizens on the other side of the line. And he says you can't get rid of that basic distinction in politics. So all of the Greeks, I think, would agree on the following point. They don't necessarily know where the line between this nation or that nation always is, right? Because the Spartans and the Athenians are both Greek. They both speak Greek. They have a lot in common. They can unite when the Persians are coming to conquer them. When the Persians aren't around, they tend to fight amongst themselves. So are they one nation? Are they two nations? Harder to say where the line is in any particular case. But they would all say there is going to be a line. Wherever it is, there's always going to be a line. It is part of human nature that human beings will organize themselves as nations and see certain groups of themselves as distinct from that group. And if we try to suppress that, we're doing something that is, in a sense, against nature. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead because I'm looking at the clock and I'm not going to be able to get through this entire geeky academic lecture. Okay, so now, what I've established, I think, from Xenophon, or tried to establish, is that we know that book makes pretty clear imperialism is not so great if you're one of the subject populations. But what if you are the ruler? Well, then it's good, right? Because we have to ask ourselves, if all these thinkers are so anti-imperialist, they must think there's nothing in it. But, you know, there's got to be something in it or nobody would do it. So it must be good if you're the ruler. Well, maybe not so fast. There could be problems not just in being ruled, but in being ruler. So in the case of Cyrus, he's one person. It's all, you know, I think of the Mel Brooks line from History of the World Part 1 with Louis the 14th is out, or I think it was the 16th anyway, he's shooting skeet, but the traps are peasants being flung into the air as he shoots. And then he says to himself smugly, it's good to be the king. It is good to be the king. If you're not the king, is it so good though? So, you know, what do Republican regimes or less monarchical regimes think they get out of imperialism? Well, they think, for one thing, it'll make them rich, right? You take other people's stuff, you have to work less, or you have more for working the same. It's the same. It's the Lincoln put it this way: you work, I eat. It sounds reasonable, but does it always work out in real life? Now, you think that someone like Machiavelli, with his reputation, would be completely on the side of the imperialists on this and say, of course, if you're strong, you go and you take their stuff, and that's the way of the world. But, you know, not so fast. I'm going to read you a little passage. This is from Prince 3. He says, when one holds a state with men at arms, one spends much, since one has to consume all the income of that state in guarding it. So the acquisition turns to a loss, and one offends much more because one harms the whole state as one army moves around for lodgings. Everyone feels this hardship, and each becomes one's enemy. And these are enemies that can harm one, since they remain, though defeated, in their homes. From every side, therefore, keeping guard in this way is useless. So he's giving you the possibility of acquisition is actually not beneficial. You think you're stealing. I mean, let's face it. That's what a certain form of imperialism is. It's just theft. I'm going to conquer your territory. I'm going to exploit your resources for my population back home. But Machiavelli's kind of saying, you know, even that doesn't work. You could spend a lot more on the acquisition than you get out of it. So you should be very careful. It can be expensive to hold. In other words, it could be expensive to hold your conquest, and not just in money, but in human beings, right? You have to have an army there. It means they're not earning money back home. It means they're subject to violence and maybe getting killed. And it's also, it can be very politically divisive back home to have imperial garrisons for decades on end, you know, serving overseas at risk and danger and so on, in a way that can be destabilizing. So I'm going to mention one more thinker here, writer, Thucydides, wrote the famous history of the Peloponnesian War, the war between Athens and Sparta. The most famous passage in Thucydides is called the Melian Dialogue. It's where a cynical Athenian ambassadors go to this little island and they say, submit to our rule. And the people in the island say, well, we don't want to, and we don't have any reason to, and you're being unjust. And the Athenians essentially just baldly say, well, there is no justice. We're stronger, you're weaker. You either submit or we'll kill you all. And the Melians, you know, say, well, that's completely wrong. Yeah, well, we'll see how, you read the book, you can find out how well that argument worked out for them. But the point that Thucydides, I think, makes is that that naked imperialistic argument, a sort of might makes right argument, was corruptive to the soul of the Athenians, right? It corrupted the public spirit of the citizenry. That human beings have to believe, if they're fighting, they have to believe they're fighting in a just cause. And one of the core reasons Athens lost that war and Sparta won is the Spartans were able to convince themselves that they were fighting in a just cause. They were fighting a defensive war. But once the Athenians just laid bare that they were fighting in a purely imperialistic, selfish project that had no connection to justice or right, it corrupted the spirit of the Athenian population at home. It rotted public morale. And it had a negative effect on their reputation abroad in that the Athenians' erstwhile allies in the Delian League, you know, who had already been kind of uncomfortable with the Delian League and Athenian rule, began to just hate the Athenians and say, you're completely cynical, and you know, there's no connection to justice here. One of the more famous chapters of The Prince makes this point in a more bald way, at chapter 17, you know, on the question of whether one wants to be feared or would prefer to be feared or loved. Of course, he says it's better to be feared than loved, and being better to be both. But the key is to avoid being hated, right? And to be, so this naked imperial project not only erodes public support at home, it erodes public support abroad. It can make a nation hated, and being hated in the international sphere can have very seriously bad costs. I would also make the point, which I'm going to skip here because it would take too long, that the American founders kind of agreed with all of this, that they would agree with Plato and Aristotle that imperialism is unjust. They would agree that, they say in the very first paragraph, everyone quotes the second paragraph, but the first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence says that the United States is now going to assume the, quote, separate and equal station among the nations of the world to which it is entitled by the laws of nature and nature's God. In other words, there's some universal law or natural law that says that nations exist and they have the right to be separate and distinct from one another, and that no nation has the right to rule another nation without that nation's consent. In other words, imperialism. They also agree, and they say throughout the Federalist Papers and elsewhere, that imperialism is expensive, it's corrosive to liberty, it requires excessive taxation, it requires a coercive draft, and so on. Okay? Now, quickly, I just want to summarize a couple things here. In his other big book, Machiavelli and the Discourses, gives an account of how the Romans took over the world. I mean, we'd have to call the Roman Empire, I think, the greatest imperial project the world has ever seen. And the surface, he seems to be all in favor of it. He talks about how, he just praises the Romans left, right, and center. If you read the book very carefully, he shows what a disaster that was, actually. 3 consequences. Loss of liberty and republicanism for 1,500 years, to the point that the American founders in writing the Federalist Papers had to spend the first 6 Federalist Papers just telling the American people, we can actually make this a republican form of government. It's not a dead, discredited idea as it seems. We can revive this and it's viable in our time. People didn't believe that, or they had to be convinced. There was a kind of, as the result of the Roman conquest, Machiavelli indicates, there was a subordination of philosophy or thought to a kind of authority that sort of homogenized the human mind in a bad way that took us a long time to get out of. And he says it basically made everyone, it diminished the spirit of human beings. It made everyone into a kind of slave. Now, there's another book, which I won't summarize, I don't have time, by Montesquieu, who wrote 3 books. This is the least famous one. It's his little book on the Romans. And he makes a similar kind of point, that the Roman conquest was a disaster, but his book is also a warning. He's writing in the 1700s, and he's looking out at Europe, and he sees various European monarchs, including the kings of France, his own country, who seem to want to restore some kind of imperial project to Europe. And he writes this little book as a warning to them, saying, don't do it. It was a disaster the first time. If you try it again, it'll be even worse. Now, they were talking about actual conquest, what we might call hard imperialism. Use your army, acquire, that's Machiavelli's anodyne term for what we're talking about. We're really talking about conquest, right? Annex, exploit. We don't have that anymore, or not much, thank God, right? We do have something, though, that's similar, kind of soft imperialism. The imperialism of transnational institutions, of homogenizing intellectual, cultural, and economic trends and products. And the word for that, I would say, is globalization, right? Now, the philosophic roots of it are complex, and I'm going to skip it because in the interest of time, again. But I will say it is attempting to do, I think, more or less through peaceful means what the Romans and Cyrus and others achieved through arms. And it is burdened by the same flaws or drawbacks. Hubris. It erodes liberty, or even outright attacks liberty. It requires centralization. It has a disastrous impact on thought and speech, both because homogenization reduces actual differences in thought, and because where that doesn't happen, the ruling class feels threatened by certain thoughts, it resorts to persecution. This is perhaps, I think, the most important and least discussed root of political correctness. As for its effect on the human soul, I'll refer to Tocqueville here, who says, the more the state or any non-civic institution does for man, the less he does for himself, the more infantilized he becomes. Now, if you're a ruler who wants a docile population, that's a feature, not a bug. If you're Cyrus, this is a good thing. You don't consider that a problem. But if you care about the fate of human freedom, you might see it differently, right? Now, its defenders, that is to say the defenders of globalization, would yell at me and say, well, that has nothing to do with conquest because it's all voluntary. I could concede the point and we could concede the point and still admit that it's bad, because being voluntary, I mean, mere consent is not the measure of goodness, I don't think. But is it even reasonable to concede the point that modern globalization is voluntary? Most electorates aren't or are rarely asked to vote on it. And when they do, they tend to vote against it. And then when they tend to vote against it, they tend not to get their way. We've seen this pattern in the EU over the past 30 years where they have a referendum on something, the people vote the wrong way, they just schedule another one in 2 or 3 years and keep doing it until the people vote the right way. Or you can vote on it and then your parliament will just say, wow, this is really complicated and we just don't know how to implement it. So can you all just go home and forget that you had the vote? As I think we're seeing going on with Brexit. So, you know, if I'm right that nationalism is in some sense natural, that maybe this or that nation isn't natural, we don't know where the border is, but there's an instinct in the human soul to form nations, to form attachments to them and be serious about them, then what happens when you try to tamp that natural force down? What happens? You can't tamp it down forever. Eventually that human force rebels, and we're seeing that rebellion now, and have been for a few years. You know, Brexit, the Trump election, Salvini, what's going on in Eastern Europe, and the Yellow Vests. Those are just some examples. I would say these rebellions are signs of life, of hope. Then we should encourage them and be encouraged by them. I'm going to just wrap up here by saying it's really, I think, in no one's interest to homogenize the world. That is, it's in no one's interests except the little army of soft Cyruses who run the world today. It's clearly in their interests. Why do they want it? Well, it makes people, as I said, docile, less trouble, less spirited, and easier to rule. It also makes them, this is something JD didn't say today, but he said it at his talk 2 days ago, and I think he's totally right about this. It makes people more interchangeable and thus fungible in the labor and the consumer markets, right? You just sort of strip out their differences, you get to a kind of common denominator humanity. It's a lot easier to market to that and sell to that and, you know, move the pieces on the checkerboard around in the labor market. Strong people, strong states, by contrast, they stand up for themselves. They're more difficult, they're more troublesome to rule. And then the last thing, I want to quote our host. I love this quote, and I've used it several times. It's very effective. It's a very simple, short quote. In his book, he summarized the beginning of his book. He says that elite conventional wisdom you can summarize on nationalism as simply this, quote, nationalism caused 2 world wars and the Holocaust, end quote. That's all you need to know about nationalism. It caused 2 world wars and the Holocaust. It's bad. Stop talking about it. Stop thinking about it. All right. I disagree with that, of course. But even if we were to stipulate it, we could still ask, does nationalism have, does a lack of nationalism has any downsides? Does a complete lack of any kind of national or fighting spirit have any downsides? I think it does. Nationalism stopped the Germans at the Marne in 1914 and ensured that the Germans didn't get into Paris, which they had done in 1870-71, and they would do again in 1940. I was going to quote Marshal Foch here. I won't. I'll skip ahead. Lack of nationalism, demoralization, contributed to the breakthrough at Sedan in May 1940, the swift collapse of the French army, the occupation of 2/3 of the country, and a hideous puppet regime in the rest. In any case, I fail to see how standing and fighting for one's own in a just cause is anything but noble. So as we think about, through this conference, you know, some of the ways nationalism can be abused, perverted, which we should, we also need to think about, which no one really thinks about except maybe us, because we're here, ways in which a lack of nationalism can be a major problem and nationalism can be the solution to a lot of problems. So thank you very much.